Ladies and gentlemen, we're very lucky to have at Triquare today one of the greatest historians of my generation, Maya Jasanoff, who has been a dazzling meteor in the field in which I work. Her first book, Edge of Empire, won the Duff Cooper Prize, as well as a clutch of other academic awards. She went on to be shortlisted for her next book on the American Revolution and the Patriots, what happened to them, for the Samuel Johnson Prize, as well as winning several American literary awards. And she's here to talk about her third book, a book within a different genre, about a different century, and about a different continent. From both her previous books, she has this amazing ability to encircle the world and operate in several different centuries. And she's part of a remarkable dynasty. Both her parents are full Harvard professors. The only black sheep of the family is her brother, who teaches at MIT down the road. And Maya's formidable combination of both Bengali and Jewish intellectual genes, which together has created a new American cyborg, the Hindu, which is gradually taking over academic institutions across the world. I have been a friend of Maya for 20 years now. We have researched together in France, spoken in America, in Harvard, but I've never seen her on my home turf. So it's very exciting to see her grappling with this strange environment, this exotic world, which we're presenting her with now. Today she's going to speak about her most recent book, about a character who I grew up believing was the last word on colonialism, on the injustices of empire, whose work was borrowed for the template for Apocalypse Now, which was certainly the coolest movie of my generation, but who now has gone slightly under a shadow, attacked by Chinua Achebe. The very phrase "Heart of Darkness" is regarded as a sort of an unlucky charm on any book about Africa that contains the word is considered tainted, and whose reputation has gone into something of a decline. And we'll deal with that, I think, at the end of this, that where Conrad stands today, which is a very different place, I think, to where he stood as recently as 20 or 30 years ago. For Maya, in her book, sees Conrad as the great literary prophet of the 19th century, in an age when most writers came from sort of Triquare-ish backgrounds, tweedy, comfortable, well-to-do, posh backgrounds. Conrad had an experience and a breadth of knowledge which simply outflanked, outmatched, and spread far wider than any other writer of his generation. And this came, as we'll discover in a few minutes, from his extraordinary life, straddling different continents, entering different worlds. But Maya sees him far more than just a fine writer. She writes in her introduction to this book that he was the first author in English to grapple with what today are the great issues of our time: terrorism, immigration, globalization, and a lovely phrase of hers, the way power operates across continents and races. Conrad's world, she writes, shimmers beneath the surface of our own. As you can tell from that prose, one of the great joys of Maya's writing is that, unlike most academics, she is a fine wordsmith and writes gorgeous and beautiful prose, and is worth reading for the beauty of her descriptions alone. But this book is a far deeper and more profound book than a mere biography. It's a complicated melange of travel writing, literary criticism, essay, and literary biography. In which she, as she puts it again in the introduction, uses the compass of the historian, the chart of the biographer, and the navigational sextant of the fiction reader. Ladies and gentlemen, Maya Jasanoff.
And William Dalrymple, you can see why I like to go on stage with him. I'll just have him do the whole talk, you know.
So I thought I might let you get a word in edgeways at some point.
Thank you. Believe me, it's a lot harder when I'm trying to interview him.
So one of the things that sort of, I think, makes Conrad so ripe for this sort of biography is that in most literary biographies, however exciting the life of the middle-aged or mature writer may be, jumping from revolution to revolution or in and out of the centre of power or kind of literary affairs with...
That's
with
only
kind
some
of,
kinds of writers, I have to say.
Exactly. But what's extraordinary about Conrad's life is that from the moment of his birth, it reads like a thriller. Maybe you give a little bit of the background of the extraordinary world of the Poland that Konrad Korzenowski was originally born into.
Sure, and let me just say thank you to the organizers of this festival for having me. It's great to speak here. At the appropriately titled Beyond Borders, because that is exactly what Conrad's life was about. He was born in 1857 in present-day Ukraine, which at the time was part of the Tsarist Russian Empire. I think if Putin had his way, it might be part of the Russian Empire again today. In any case, he was born to Polish parents at a time when Poland itself had been wiped off the map of Europe. It had been partitioned up among other empires in the late 18th century. And so people of Polish extraction were, of course, living under imperial powers around Eastern Europe. Conrad's parents belonged to actually a sort of Triquarish set, I think, a sort of landed gentry, very much cultural minority as Poles in this Ukrainian and Russian-speaking region. And his parents were vigorous Polish nationalists who were incredibly committed to bringing back an independent Polish nation from under the rule of these, in particular, the Tsarist Empire, Prussians and Austrians as well. So Conrad was raised in this funny environment of sort of a deeply romantic nationalism, lots of resonances, actually, I think, with 18th century Scottish nationalism here, saturated in particular with Polish poetry, which was the great kind of vehicle for cultivating this romantic nationalist spirit. He memorized reams of Adam Mickiewicz and other poets as a boy. And his parents' nationalism ended up leading them into activities for which they were arrested and prosecuted as seditious traitors. And when Conrad was very, very young, his father was sentenced to exile deep in Russia, way out into kind of very inclement parts of Russia.
Before that, as a baby in a cot, the secret police are breaking into the flat.
He was 3 or 4 years old when this happens. In Warsaw, his father was going to launch an underground newspaper, and the Tsarist police showed up before the paper could come off the printing press and rounded up his father, took him off into the Citadel prison in Warsaw. He was then sentenced to exile. So the family, just three of them.
Earliest memories of him being held by his mother outside the gates of this prison.
He later says that he remembers going to the courtyard to visit his father in jail, and he says quite movingly, in the courtyard of this citadel, my earliest memories were formed, like many of those from my nation. So strong Polish consciousness, sent off into exile, where his parents both end up contracting tuberculosis and dying one after the other, leaving Conrad an orphan at the age of 11. He's then raised by largely a maternal uncle, very kind of mobile and tortured childhood, again, saturated with this idea of nationalism, which has led his parents to an early grave. Displaced across borders and within and beyond the Russian Empire, with a sense of belonging to a place that doesn't exist on the map, and with a sense of dispossession also, not least from becoming orphaned at the age of 11.
And bizarrely, for someone brought up in the heart of mainland Europe, longs for the sea.
Yes, so at the age of 16, this young Joseph Theodor Conrad Korzenowski, who has remembered visiting his father in the courtyard of the Citadel, who remembers walking through the streets of Krakow following his father's funeral cortege, dreams of a career very different from that of his parents, who would have raised him to be a Polish patriot. He dreams instead of going to sea. And in a way, it's quite baffling for someone who's hundreds of miles away from the sea throughout his youth. And yet, in another way, I think it's extremely understandable, because he had spent all of his time fantasizing about how to get away. He had read sea novels. He had dreamed of running away from this very tortured background that he came from. And the most remarkable thing of all is that when he says to his uncle, I really want to become a sailor. I really want to become a sailor. The uncle, who's of course desperate for him to become something practical, like a lawyer or an accountant or something like that, actually gives in and decides to let him go off to sea and sends him off with a small allowance to Marseille, where he goes in 1874, 17 years old. He gets taken up there by French, Polish ship owners. There's a kind of Polish diaspora in France. Conrad speaks French fluently as a member of this sort of gentry class. French is the second language. And so he goes off to become a sailor. And what's even yet more surprising is that his uncle, who presumably thinks, he'll go off to sea one voyage, he'll hate it, get seasick, never want to do it again. Actually, Conrad likes it, and he sticks it, and he goes on one voyage, and then another, and it becomes his career.
But before long, there's a suicide attempt.
Just to spoiler alert. So before long, so he goes on one ship after another, but there are a couple of catches here. One is that he is a spendthrift. He has an allowance from his uncle. Somehow he goes through the money. I was actually just talking to a Conrad scholar yesterday and saying, what is he spending it on? Because he doesn't drink very much. He doesn't womanize. He's in this way an extremely unrepresentative sailor in certain respects. And he's not really a gambler, but we think he just kind of lives beyond his means. He gives loans to friends when he can't afford it himself. And he's constantly running short of money. And he gets these chastising letters from his uncle saying, don't ask me for more money. Whatever you do, don't ask me for more money. Of course, the uncle then gives it to him, but whatever. And then the other problem that he faces is one of a labor market constraint. So he's sailing on these French ships, but he's doing so as a Russian subject. And it is at a time when, in order to get onto a foreign employer, you need to have permission from your native government. And the Russians are not very keen for this young man of military age to be going off on French vessels. The merchant marine, by the way, is always the kind of reserve force for the Navy in a time of war. So Conrad fudges it. He manages to kind of talk his way onto the ships without getting the Russian approval, but he hits a limit when they start cracking down on this and he's no longer able to get work. So between running out of money and not being able to get a job, he's in a pretty tricky situation. And so in the summer of 1878, all of it sort of comes to a head. He borrows money from a friend. He goes off to Monte Carlo thinking, okay, I'm going to gamble it and I'm going to make a lot of money and come back and everything will be okay. Of course, he goes to Monte Carlo. He loses all of it, comes back to Marseille, invites his friend to tea to confess what has happened. And before the friend shows up, he picks up a pistol, points it at his chest, and pulls the trigger. It is a flesh wound, as they say in 19th century documents. He misses his heart, but it's obviously a pretty significant critical moment in his young life. His uncle is summoned from Ukraine, comes over to Marseille. They have a kind of heart-to-heart, so to speak, about what to make of his future. And Conrad has decided that, why doesn't he try to go off on an English ship, because they don't require the same kinds of permissions there. And so the next step is that he signs onto an English ship, and from then on, he finds himself working in the largest merchant marine in the world and the one that is most open to foreign labor.
And London, you paint in your book, a rather surprising picture of, we're used to this Dickensian London of sort of urchins and carriages rattling through with grand ladies in it. But you paint a picture of an immigrant London populated with the exiles of 100 countries. Yeah, so, the London of today, which is by many measures the most cosmopolitan city in the world with citizens from, over 150 countries, the antecedents of that London can already be found in Conrad's time. And when Conrad comes to London in the 1870s, it is already a meeting place for migrants from all of the different
European revolutionary movements of earlier in the 19th century, all of the Latin American revolutionary movements from earlier in the 19th century. And there's this pretty substantial community, particularly of Germans, Italians, taking hold in different parts of London. Conrad himself is one of many thousands of Russian Poles who are coming into London at this time. And so the London that he sees is this London of Soho and Clerkenwell and the places where these immigrants are kind of making communities and in some cases creating little underground political movements. So it's no accident that Karl Marx is writing his manifestos in the British Library, because this is a place where there's relative freedom of movement. There is not a secret police in the way you will have in many continental European countries. There are not laws against the circulation of printed materials in the way there might be in other continental European countries. It's kind of a haven for migrants, and some of them rather dissident migrants as well.
This is a very unusual picture of London today, because we often get this picture in particularly post-colonial literature of Britain as the great oppressor, with this heavy imperial foot sitting down on India, on Africa, and many other parts of the world. But in your book, you get the impression of London as a place which is very open to foreigners, which is not a closed border, racist and unwelcoming place, but which is a surprisingly cosmopolitan.
Yeah, I mean, these things are not all either ors. That is to say, I mean, I think it's very important to remember. So London and Britain in the later 19th century are freer to immigration, do not have the secret police, have less in the way of monitoring and so forth than any other continental European nation. That said, of course, first of all, in parts of the empire, you will have laws against the circulation of printed material and so on. So these things operate in at the same time. And also, well, let's just add, especially following the previous panel, the situation of the Irish. So one very interesting thing that's happening in Conrad's era is that he is in London at the time of the Fenian bombing campaigns, which start in the 1870s, and the beginnings of modern terrorism and modern counterterrorism are taking shape in London around the issue of Irish nationalism. So we have both of these things going on at once. We have London on the one hand as very open to continental European migration, as relatively open to printed matter being circulated and so on. And then on the other hand, being the place in which, in many ways, modern terrorist bombing campaigns are and the suppression of them are also taking place, because it is an imperial capital as well as this kind of cosmopolitan European city.
And a world of bomb blasts going off,
yes,
and anarchist plots.
Exactly. So one of the things that I explore in my book is, so Conrad went on to write one of the great novels about urban terrorism, The Secret Agent. And in The Secret Agent, he describes a bomb plot to go after the Greenwich Observatory. And it's based on a real incident in which a Frenchman was found blown up near Greenwich, the victim of his own explosive, it turns out. And this guy was linked to a group of anarchists who had found a haven in London. Now, I think what Conrad does very interestingly in this book is that he takes the bomb plot, but rather than turn it into a book about anarchists and how awful anarchists are, he turns it into a book about agents provocateurs, because the people who are behind this plot, and this is incredibly resonant thinking about politics today, the people who are behind this plot in Conrad's novel are the Russians, sitting in the Russian embassy, trying to get agents provocateurs to ignite a bomb so that the British, famed for their liberties, will crack down on the institutions of civil society. And what Conrad is mirroring here is something that actually did happen, which is that with the emergence of the Fenians in particular, you see the British liberal state starting to take on some of the apparatus of a police state. Let's remember that London today, incredibly cosmopolitan, also has CCTV cameras pointed in every single corner of the city. So you have this culture of surveillance taking shape as well. And what Conrad detects is that although it is the Fenians, the Irish, who are setting off the bombs, the repercussions will affect people from other parts of the world as well. And by the time Conrad writes The Secret Agent, the discussion in Britain has moved on from, how do we deal with terrorism from the Irish to how do we keep out certain kinds of unsavory characters from our shores. And it is right in the aftermath of the passage of a piece of legislation in Britain called the Aliens Act that restricts immigration for the first time in British history around the continent and so on, that Conrad publishes The Secret Agent. And he recognizes something that we see very clearly today, where the threat from one corner can be turned into a far more sort of politicized and expansive idea of others who are threatening who we are. And remember that his books are written by an immigrant into Britain who learns English as his third language, always with a very thick accent, who is always aware of that kind of push and pull. You can be open in some ways and you can be incredibly closed and oppressive, and increasingly so in others.
Another mirror that you reflect from Conrad's life onto the present is this idea of technological change, that Conrad is, even as he's taking British citizenship and ending up in London, the whole world of clippers and big sailing ships that he's a master of is being turned into an outmoded technology by steam.
Yeah, so this was something that was actually came as a surprise to me as I was working on the book. So Conrad spent 20 years of his life as a working sailor. And in a certain way, as I've already indicated, his life is emblematic of a certain kind of openness that was available to certain kinds of immigrants in Britain at that time. He's able to ascend through the ranks. It's a career open to talent. He takes an exam, through an exam system. He becomes a certified master in the British Merchant Marine. At the same time, he's sailing through a period of transformation on the seas as the sail-powered ships of the mid-19th century are giving way to the steam vessels on shorter on progressively longer routes as it becomes more and more cost-efficient for these coal-powered vessels to overtake the sailing-powered ones. And what Conrad finds as he's sailing across this divide is a form of technological obsolescence for a certain form of laborer that is very similar, I think, to what you would find in, say, I don't know, the Kodak film developing factories today, right? Like, this is not a thing anymore that is widespread. We now all have cameras in our pockets, right? So Conrad sees this transformation in a labor of technology, not only in the way that the boosters do. Look, now the ships can go, more reliably, and they can be cheaper, and they can be faster. But he sees it from the other side. He sees it from the side of the laborers who are getting dispossessed, de-skilled, and rendered obsolete. And for him, this difference between sail and steam becomes an incredibly important kind of through line in his fiction. And you'll find that, he very much romanticizes the sailing ship, writing from the early 20th century when they're largely kind of things of the past. He writes very romantically of them, knowing that people are feeling nostalgic.
And at some length. A lot of his work is sailing ships.
Very much. But there's something more important for him about it, romantic though it is, which is that he does detect that there are differences in the ways of life. That on a sailing ship, people had certain kinds of skills. You had a different sort of organization of laborers because you had people who had to man the sails and so on, and it's a kind of team effort in certain sorts of ways. He knows that you have to be sensitive to nature on a sailing ship, obviously, in really acute ways. And he sees the sailing ship as a kind of model community, it has to be said, all male, often all white, not always, but very limited sort of community, but one in which people are committed to this idea of something bigger than themselves in Conrad's world. Whereas on the steamship, it's this kind of atomized community. You don't need to have those skills, the way he puts it. You just need to shovel coal into the boiler. You need an engineer, you shovel coal into the boiler. Everybody's kind of just in it for themselves. The sense of the bigger purpose, the code of conduct stretching back over centuries is for Conrad totally loosened on the steamship. And when you read a Conrad novel, when it's set on a steamship, something is going to go wrong.
So all this time, he's now exploring Southeast Asia, he's in Borneo, in Singapore, and he's just for the first time beginning to try his hand at writing.
Yes, he starts, first of all, he learns English. Let's not forget that. He's 21 when he first arrives in the UK, and it is then that he starts to learn English. He says he starts to learn it from the folks on the Norfolk coal ship that he takes up and down between Newcastle and Norfolk on some coal runs, and he picks up English to, of course, what will be a really phenomenal and extraordinary extent. He starts writing sometime in the 1880s, later 1880s, when he's already a British subject. He's a master in the Merchant Marine, and he builds his earliest plots on his own experiences sailing around the Malay archipelago, in particular on, as it happens, a tramp steamer. And I think this is really interesting because we know that he's writing well before he stops sailing. And we also know that he takes with him the stories and the experiences of one region into another. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about Conrad, thinking here about Beyond Borders, is that this is a person who doesn't just see lots of places in the world. He, I think like many of us, layers his experiences of the world. So it is as a Polish subject of the Russian Empire that he goes to France and goes to Britain and sees the British world. It is as a British sailor that he then goes to Southeast Asia and experiences there the maritime worlds that bring together Malays and Arabs and Chinese and Dutch and English. And it is as a sailor experienced in that realm and on the high seas that he then goes up the Congo River, bringing with him up the Congo River when he goes on a journey there in 1890, the manuscript of what will be his first novel set on a river estuary in Borneo. So this kind of layering of the different places is one of the ways in which I think Conrad has this very, what I would consider to be a sort of globalized consciousness, in which we're not just talking about different places in isolation. We're talking about the ways that they interconnect and the ways that any one of our perspectives on the world is inflected by the places where we have already been.
And so let's focus for a minute on Congo. He can't get a job in England. He goes to Belgium and he gets sent off to the Congo. What's going on there at this point? What is happening?
Well, I mean, this is a fascinating and quite chilling story that we could spend hours alone talking about. But I think the way that I'd like to present it, so the Congo Free State, as it is called, is established with the approval of the international community coming out of the Congress of Berlin in 1885. It is called the Congo Free State because the idea of it is that it is an independent state, that it is free in the sense that it is free to trade from around the world. Any power can, any people, any companies can go there and trade, and free in terms of labor. That it will not have slavery, which has been going on in Africa and beyond. By the way, Brazil has slavery until 1888. And there's a lot of slaving going on in Eastern Africa into the Congo extended basin from the east. So the Congo Free State, as it is grandly laid out on maps in Berlin by a bunch of Europeans around a conference table, is going to be this model state for the future of Africa. In reality, what it is basically the entire opposite of everything that it is said to be. So it is run as essentially a personal domain of King Leopold of the Belgians, who had been lobbying very skillfully to get this whole thing approved by the international community. Rather than being free in terms of trade and labor, it is an incredibly extractive, brutally rapacious economic system in which a handful of European agents under the authority of this one or handful of Belgian trading companies are going up the river, grabbing first ivory and then subsequently rubber from the interior and taking it out. And contrary to the notion of free labor, it is really anything but, because as this state takes shape, they depend in ever-increasing numbers on conscripted laborers from the villages of Congo. There's some imported labor from West Africa, even from further afield, and essentially people are rounded up in the villages and in the Congo River Basin and forced by force of the lash and the gun to labor in conditions of extraordinary brutality.
And Conrad's onto this pretty quick. He sees skeletons chained to posts and bodies rotting in the bush.
It's a horrific thing, and for which I highly recommend reading Adam Hochschild's book, King Leopold's Ghost, some of you may know of. So Conrad goes in very early into the Congo operations. Again, it's formed officially in 1885. He goes in 1890. He goes in very much influenced by the rhetoric that is so widespread in Europe. Oh, this is, civilizing mission. We're going to bring them, all the benefits of free trade and commerce and industry and Christianity and blah, blah, blah. And he goes, and Conrad doesn't buy the Christianity part of it, I have to say, but he goes in thinking, okay, well, why not, And I should say, by the way, he's sort of cornered into the job because he can't find better jobs on sailing ships. He can't find better jobs on British ships. He can't find better jobs at a higher rank. But in any case, he goes in thinking, all right, here's what I'm doing. Within a matter of days of arriving, he sees that this is a very different kind of place. The Europeans he meets, he loathes, with one exception, the one exception being a young man he meets a bit upriver who's working on the railroad, who's helping with the engineering, who's an Irishman by the name of Roger Casement. And it will be many years later that this young Irishman who'd been working, on the railroad in Congo, and this young Pole, Korzeniowski, who'd been working on the steamship in Congo, will later meet as Sir Roger Casement, the great diplomat and exposer of so many horrific imperial crimes, and Joseph Conrad, the celebrated English novelist. So it's an amazing kind of small world thing. But anyway, he loathes the people he meets. He obviously feels deeply alienated for reasons to do not least, I think, with racism by the society that he's in. He sees that every one of these ideals is complete nonsense. That they're betraying it right and left. There's incredible brutality and violence. He himself is also very physically ill throughout his journey there. And he's supposed to be there for 3 years. He sails up and down the river once, and that is enough. This perennially, cash-strapped person who has lots of trouble getting a job resigns this 3-year job and goes home in a state of physical and mental, I think, despair.
And out of this comes several literary works, not just the famous Heart of Darkness, but the Almayer's Folly. He's written on this, and
yes, I mean, so Conrad, while he's traveling up and down the Congo River, he has a couple of things with him. He has a small journal where he's making notes on navigation for how to get up and down the river, which is a remarkable document in terms of just seeing how sailors are keeping track of this. And I was struck. I went down the Congo myself a couple of years ago, and I was struck that the way that they're navigating the river now, the captain was in his little, bridge looking down on the river, and he had a very well-worn volume of sketches of where the sandbanks were, and each one was sort of a 10-kilometer stretch, and he would just turn the pages as we went along. And this was very much the way that Conrad was navigating it 100 years ago. So he's got this journal, but he also has with him the manuscript of what will become his first novel, Almayer's Folly. And while it is very common for us to read, and rightly so, of course, Heart of Darkness as the novel that comes out of his time in Congo, let's remember this layering that I was mentioning. If you look at Almayer's Folly as itself a book in which Conrad is working through ideas about commerce and about empire and about displacement on a river estuary, and that he's writing this while he's in Congo, I think it just helps put all of this into a kind of richer framework.
And how old is he when this first novel is published?
He's in his later 30s, so for anyone who's hoping for new careers, pick up a new language and write a novel in it. You can still do that in your later 30s or 40s.
And then he makes this other sort of surprising transformation for a man that's been on the move, starts off in Poland, is on ships for 25 years, suddenly sort of settles down in Kent and becomes an English novelist with a new name.
Yeah, I mean, it's a journey. It's a journey. Life is a journey. It's a set of transformations. But I mean, I think that how he becomes a novelist, there is a degree of this that we will never understand. Why people do things to an extent depends on things we won't know. He comes from a highly literate family. His father is a man of letters. He is writing and reading from very, very early in his life. So with the publication of Almayer's Folly, he starts to and with the constraints of the labor market for sailing, he gradually kind of grows further and further away from the sea. And he gets married to a young English girl from Peckham named Jessie George, and with her sets
Who's
up
a kind of
life.
slightly unremarkable figure in your book.
Well,
she's
I mean,
slightly wallpaper at the background.
I like to think she's a little more than that in my book, but she's very much that in other people's books. No, Jessie George, Conrad's wife, is she's an English working class girl. She's a teenager when they meet. She is
And Conrad's
totally
never shown any
unlike-
interest in women we can see much before.
Conrad's only interests in women that we know of are sort of francophone, genteel women that he can have nice little flirtations with, but nothing develops too seriously. So this is a very different. This is a real departure. And yet, I think they end up having a really quite lovely marriage, and which is actually contingent, I'm sorry to say, on their mutual illnesses. So he is constantly sick with one thing or another. He's a depressive. I mean, he's a clinical depressive. There's no question about that. He has gout. He's kind of grumpy, but he has gout in his legs. He has gout in his hands. He has one thing after another there. And then she has all kinds of problems with mobility and her knees. And I'm thinking about this. I sprained my ankle badly the other day, so I'm very sympathetic to people who look after each other when they're hobbling around. And so they actually have a very loving relationship. And I think in a way it's exactly what Conrad has never had in his life. He's never had a home with someone to look after him and with someone he can look after.
And there aren't a whole lot of women in his novels.
There aren't. I mean, this is, I think we should probably move on to this as a sort of final point before hearing from the audience. But I mean, Conrad is widely thought of today as a racist. There was an essay by Chinua Achebe calling out very rightly the representation of Africa in Heart of Darkness and saying, look, I mean, Africa is this screen against which Europeans get to project their ideas of what it is to be civilized and savage. And he's quite right. I mean, that is how Africa figures in Heart of Darkness. Africans do not have speaking roles in Heart of Darkness. Conrad is interested in exploring something about what he takes to be a universal human sense of civilization and savagery, but he's interested in exploring that against this backdrop.
But the savagery in Heart of Darkness is perpetrated largely by Europeans.
It is. I mean, one can go on at greater length about this. I mean, I would say that Conrad is interested in a sort of universal set of conditions, but let's remember that any of us, when we talk about universals, are spinning universals out from a certain set of experiences, and Conrad is spinning his vision of universals out of his experiences as a white man operating in this context.
Those ships shelling the jungle.
Exactly. So I think Achebe's points are very well taken and need to be read alongside Heart of Darkness. When I teach it, for example, you'd always put these two things together. That said, Conrad has come down now as the racist. Why should we read Conrad? Lots of pushback against including Conrad in curricula. Achebe himself never said don't read it. He just said be aware of where it's coming from, and that's very much my position too, which is that I think that we need to recognize that every position is contingent on the place from which it is made.
But for his time, he was incredibly prophetic about empire
Well,
was far more critical of empire. I mean, he's a contemporary and a neighbor of Kipling.
He's
who's
an
sitting
incredible
there now.
critic of empire. So I think that what we need to realize is that things are not mutually exclusive. You can hold multiple truths at the same time, and this actually follows.
Begin to sound like Rudy Giuliani here.
But I was thinking about this in the previous discussion, right? Because the U.S. right now is in such a polarized space, and I have this discussion with people all the time, and I say, look, it's not about people. Everyone wants to talk. Everyone wants to talk. The thing is, who's going to listen? And I believe very firmly, and here I differ from people. I think that I know. I believe very firmly that we need to listen to each other in order to advance conversations. So we have to recognize that there are multiple. You can be a racist and an anti-imperialist. You can be prophetic in one domain and not so much in others. And I think that you can also have conversations that evolve over time. And so, my view about it is, first of all, Conrad is a racist. Well, tell me which 19th century British novelists that we read are not. I mean, really, I think Conrad is the person who's going out there and engaging with these issues. Other people are not. Does that mean that we're happy to read the people who don't look at this, but we're not happy to read the person who does, even if we disagree with him? That's an open question, but I would say it helps us. I would also say that
Wagner and is it?
Well,
Wagner
I mean, I think that the question is, what is the conversation we're having? And we're having a conversation, which I think is a deeply important conversation about cultural relativism, about universalism, about how different regions react to others, about imbalances of power, about persistences in those imbalances of power. We're having that conversation. Why are we having that conversation? We're having it because we're reading Conrad. And we're moving along from it in our present. We're more aware of certain dynamics now because we've been able to reflect on this over the past. So I'm a historian. I believe we need to look at these things. I believe we need to engage with them. I don't believe in saying, I don't want to read that. That's hateful ideas. I believe in saying, look, let's think about how these things operate. Let's think about how we've changed, how maybe we haven't changed, and let's try to have the discussions, because it is out of the discussions that we can move to new places.
Final question before we move on to the audience. If you take one Conrad novel to a desert island, if someone in the audience here somehow has missed out on Conrad, what should they start with?
Well, I mean, I think Heart of Darkness is the one to start with, I have to say. I mean, it's just a brilliant piece of work. I mean, it's
novella
challenging. It's a novella. Okay, short. So it depends on what you want on your desert island. If you want something really long to keep you going, bring Nostromo. If you are not going to a desert island, as I think most of you are not, and you just want to read some Conrad, then go read Heart of Darkness. And I think that the reason is that I've read it a million times, and I always come out thinking about things a little differently. I notice a different phrase here or there or whatever. And I think that the magic, the genius touch of that novel, and why I think it goes beyond this is racist, let's not read it, is that he makes a move which for the time was radical, and a move that I think we all need to make today. And that is that what happens over there, Conrad says, is coming from over here. What happens over here is going over there. We are all connected in ways that we have to think about. And we cannot simply look at issues elsewhere in the world and say, oh, that's them, that's their problem. We cannot simply look at ourselves and say, we are better than this. We are all kind of in this together. And I think that saying to the past, oh, you were racist and we are not, is just every bit as problematic as saying what's happening over there has nothing to do with us. We are all connected. We're all part of this lineage, and we should be reading and engaging with these texts.
Lady in the front here.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Maya. That was really interesting. It's inspired me to go back and read some more Conrad. I'm really interested in how it is that a writer writes primarily or predominantly in a language which isn't their first language. It's not a very common phenomenon, and I think it's a really significant one. You could argue that you're automatically in some process of going beyond an internal border when you make that linguistic shift. Now, one of my interests is, what is somebody able to do in another language? What are they able to write about in another language which they can't do, or that they're not writing about because they're not writing in the first language? And I was really curious when you said that Conrad was depressed in his later life. It seems to me that something stopped him writing about Poland, Tsarist Russia, those early experiences. Maybe he couldn't write about that in English. He would have had to go back to Polish.
Yeah, I mean, he was depressed throughout his life. If anything, he got a little bit less depressed toward the end, which fits, by the way, with new psychological research that says we get happier as we get older. So that's a nice thing to look forward to. So he...
Everything else falling apart.
I mean, it's an interesting point. He doesn't write about Poland very much at all, and I think there's something to what you say. have recently gotten a little insight into this. So my mother is a native speaker of Bengali and learned English as her second language. And I recently started to learn Hindi just this past year. And it was fascinating to me to do this after having written a book about somebody who's working in this other language, because I was thinking about how you kind of navigate through different languages. Anyone multilingual will have thought this through. So I know that, for example, for my mother, English is the language that she, as an adult in, thinks in, writes in, reads in. It's the language of her higher education. And for Conrad, there is no doubt that French and English were the languages of his higher education. So I think that his simple sort of mastery of Polish to write in would not have necessarily been something he would have felt confident in for creative pursuits. Now, French versus English is a bit of a question, but I think he was surrounded by an English milieu, and he knew that there was a bigger English readership. And then that brings in a different issue, which is what is the relationship between the writer and the market that they think that they're going to serve? And Conrad was at once very aware of that, and on the other hand, obviously not terribly good at it, because his first bestseller came about quite late in his life, and I think it's good for us that he wasn't simply writing pot boilers, but
it had a girl on the cover.
It had a girl on the cover. It made it sell better. But I think it's a very fascinating question. And, when I was learning this other language, I was thinking, well, it makes me aware of moves that you can make. It makes me aware of what is communicable in one way that is not communicable in another. And I leave it to critics who are better versed in these things than me to really delve into it. But, let's just note how unbelievably amazing an achievement it is. And also, I think, as you say, that it's about crossing borders from the get-go of putting the pen to the page.
Lady at the back with her hand up.
Thank you. English is my second language, and I think I can say and write in English what I couldn't do in my first language. It's impersonal. If I were to write in Dutch, it would give a lot of me away, and I can write in English, and I can swear in English. It doesn't mean anything to me, but I couldn't possibly swear in Dutch. And I think that may have something to do with it.
Yeah, there's a distancing that happens, and there are many signature features to Conrad's writing, but I think one of them, which may bear on this conversation, is his use of multiple narrators in his texts. You take Heart of Darkness. It's told, we think of it. Those of you who know the text will know that it opens on the Thames estuary. A group of men are sitting around on a ship, and Charlie Marlowe, an old sea captain, is telling a story about his experience in Congo, he doesn't name the place, but his experience on a river. That, in turn, though, is given to us by one of the listeners on this ship. So it's a threefold thing. It's, here's the ship, then here's a person listening to the story telling us about it, then there's the person telling the story, and then there's the story itself. And that idea of the layering and the distancing, I think, is something that has an obvious analogy to the idea that, here's one language, then another, then another. All of our stories and all of our experience are nested in other ones, and that is kind of the great takeaway of Joseph Conrad.
One last question.
I think.
We're done?
Yeah.
Done. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, last big clap, please. Very much.